but you get a much simpler mesh. And in your Google Drive, I just put this, let's see, whoops, I put the wrong one in. This one. So there's a photo in there of like a vent. And desktop. Let's say you really loved that vent and you wanted a model of it. So I'm just going to drag that photo into Blender, and by default it'll put it into my camera view. And the first thing you want to do is make sure the resolution of your scene matches the resolution of your photo. So to find the resolution of your photo, if you go into Properties on a Windows, or if you hit Command-I on a Mac, it'll bring up the info settings. And in Details, I see that this resolution is 3264 by 2448. So I'll put that in, 3264 by 2448. And now the photo is no longer stretched anymore. And I see it back here. And it's kind of like modeling from blueprints. I'm going to split my view just so you guys can see what my camera is doing. Let me turn on screencast keys. So here's my camera. And it helps if you know like what picture the camera, or like what your camera was. Like this was taken with an iPhone, but we'll get to that in a second. So what I like to do is to clear all my camera's rotation and location. So I'm going to hit Alt-G, and my camera jumped to the center, and I'm going to hit Alt-R. And now it's like pointing down. And so in this view, I don't see any grid or anything because it's I'm looking down through the floor. So then I'm going to hit G and Z, which means I want to go up on the Z axis by 5. And I'm starting to see a grid. Right there, I see my Y and my X. And now I'm going to rotate around this center, because my cursor is in the center. If it's not, do Shift-S, cursor to center. And I'm going to change the pivot point, where we're rotating around the 3D cursor. So now I can see that manipulator. And I'm going to rotate on the X. So what I'm kind of trying to do is like line up where I imagine this ground is with this grid. And if you're having a hard time seeing, if you go into your background images, you can like reduce the opacity. So that looks fine to me right now. And then I'm going to rotate it on the Z axis. And then I'm going to push it, like basically I want this origin to be this corner. So I'm still have my pivot point around the 3D cursor, and I've kind of lined it up right there. It's not quite good, but if you hit R to rotate your camera, and if you hit X twice, you can see I'm going to do so my camera's local rotation, the X right here, I'm going to like bring it up like that. But if you have your pivot point in the center and you do R and X twice, it's a really good trick for like bringing that down. But I'm having a hard time lining up these points because I didn't use a 35mm camera, which is the default presets for Blender. So if you know the focal length of the camera or can kind of guess it, and the sensor size, that really helps. But Blender also has these presets, so I'm just going to go to the iPhone 5 preset, which sets the focal length to 4.1 and the sensor width to 4.4. So that's pretty neat. And then let me try moving this back into position. So if you do know your camera's presets, I would set that right at the beginning. And I'm going to bring that down, or rotate it. Okay, the key to this is to not be too picky. Like I'm seeing, things aren't lining up perfectly, but cameras often have like optical distortion where like things bend around kind of a sphere, so you're never going to get it perfect. It's good just to get it close. So I made a cube, and I want that cube's origin to be at that corner as well, so then when I scale it, it'll like grow from that corner. So I'm going to go into edit mode, hold control, and if I grab this X thing and this like little manipulator, and if I'm holding control, it moves it by those units. It like snaps to that unit. So now the origin is right on that corner. I'm in object mode, and now if I scale it on the X, it grows that way, or just scale it this way. I'm going to go into wireframe mode. I'm going to scale it out this way, go into edit mode, face select. I'm just pushing it out. I'm going to bring this up a bit and bring that back face in a bit. And now it's like, it's pretty good. It's not perfect though. Okay, so here's the first kind of basic unwrapping technique that you do for photo scanning. I brought that photo into Blender just by dragging it in, so it's already in the UV image editor. If I select this mesh in edit mode, we'll go back here. And then if I hit U to unwrap and project from view, we see that the UV like pretty much went where that object was. Let me go into cycles render. So we're not seeing anything yet. And I'll make a new material. I'm just going to add the image texture with Control T and switch it to that image texture. So it's looking like pretty bad and distorted. And that's because we're trying to stretch this picture across this plane. So to get over that distortion, just add a few loop cuts. So now this is more square. And it automatically added the loop cuts to your UV, and it helped clean up some of the distortion. The rest of it, I'm just going to add a subdivision surface and set it to simple. So what that's doing is it's giving me more cuts, but I'm not actually making a higher poly mesh because I can turn it off if I need it. So that looks pretty good. But it's not perfect yet because all this weird stuff is happening. So instead of like making a weird object, like let's say I used to say, oh, I'm going to just move this point so it lines up with the picture, right? And then you get out and you no longer have a rectangle. So what you want to do is do it to the UV object. So select all your UVs. Let me move that back. And let me just pull this. Let me show you what's going on. In textured mode, if I just pull this corner into position and pull that into position, you can kind of fix whatever problems you had with positioning your camera. I'm going to select these two. And the shortcuts are all the same. I'm just using G to grab. Let me get it a little closer. And you guys get the idea. I'll turn that back on. And now, like, we've kind of photo scanned that vent. I could use it. Yeah, you could like pretty easily use this in another model or whatever. So that's kind of a different way of photo scanning. It gets kind of interesting if you were to add a plane, scale that up, and you could start adding the same picture to this plane, so you could have a ground. I'll just extrude those up. So hit U, project from view. There's that UV, and I'll just set it to the same material, and I'll make it some square and subdivide it a little bit. And we'll just turn this brightness up. So now we have this like this little scene that was projected on, it's a much simpler, cleaner mesh. To get rid of those edges, if you set your picture to not repeat but to clip, it'll just go to black. And then you can move your camera around and yeah. So that is one way to add like depth to pictures as well. You just project the picture onto geometry. Yay.